Hi guys, this is Mr. Tan. So what are the learning outcomes? Well, for the first assignment, which is going to be a poster viva, it says learning outcome 1 is to investigate patterns and relationships between parts of thematic areas where crisis management in tourism and hospitality merges. The second learning outcome is to analyze communication tools and strategies used by tourism organizations or tourism destinations to manage effective recovery from crisis. And then the third learning outcome is to apply theoretical approaches of crisis management in tourism and hospitality in real situation. I'm not really going to go into CW2 because we're going to cover that in another video that covers learning outcomes 4, 5 and 6. So if we look at the first 3 learning outcomes, we're going to have to really break this down, and I'm going to keep stopping and starting and going through the different questions so we understand the questions. So the first question says to investigate patterns and relationships between parts of thematic areas where crisis management in tourism and hospitality merges. We need to identify the keyword here. The keyword here is to investigate, to do more research, to find out, with statistical or secondary information, what were the patterns and relationships of that thematic area. We need to understand what we mean by thematic area. What do we mean by this? We need to understand what we mean by crisis management in tourism and hospitality merges. So, what is the thematic area, and how does that impact upon, crisis management in tourism and hospitality, and the relationships and patterns between these two. So, I'm not going to look at the other two, but we will go into more detail in the other 2 learning outcomes later. So, we have different typologies of different disasters, including natural disasters, man-made disasters, deliberate disasters, and accidental disasters. But from this list, the most predictable is natural disasters that we've seen, I would suggest. But then again, we have seen loads of other disasters from terrorism and so on and so forth that have arisen around the world. But in the main, we've seen a lot more natural than any other disasters. So due to this predictability, more specific crisis plans can be developed. So these natural disasters have been experienced before and often follow frequency, which could be associated with sessions and weather patterns. So again, we're saying to ourselves, if this is the case, well then how are we going to plan for this? And later on in the learning outcome 3, we're going to look at various models like the phase model and the Faulkner model of crisis management. And these 2 models kind of like give an indication of what one could do to pre-plan for these disasters if, for example, it's a natural disaster and it happens on a regular basis. So there are different types of crises, including, geological ones, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis seen in Thailand, earthquakes and seen in Japan. Likewise, we've got extreme weather, floods, hurricane, wildfire, tornadoes. The wildfires we've seen, in parts of the US and near Florida. We've seen it with the wildfires in Australia, and these have been devastating to those areas. You've got society and political events, including crime, high crime, or political riots or coups, or terrorism, war. You have technological crises, including transportation or accidents. Health related, we've seen, all too often now with the new COVID and the first COVID, the Delta variant, the Omicron variant, and now the new variant from France. So we've seen SARS, salmonella, cholera, malaria. We've seen economic crises in terms of the financial crisis, exchange rate collapses, and we've seen environmental human induced events, including ecological damage, oil spills. So there are a wide range of different types of crises on the different areas, including environmental events, including social, political events, including health-related events, economic and technological. So, and these exist all too frequently all around the world. There are different classifications of crises, and this has an impact later on in the second assignment, but we're going to be looking at the basics now and be going into a lot more detail later. So there are potential crises, latent crises, acute crises, and natural and human-induced crises. So potential crisis. Crisis is imaginary or has not yet taken place. So this is the ideal base for planning and setting the crisis management goals. For example, a cruise ship imagining a mass food poisoning episode on a ship and planning accordingly. What will they do? What would be the actions? Latent crisis. A crisis that's already broken out, started to take place. Not yet identifiable according to normal company procedures. Normal company procedures are not yet subject to restriction. Example, on a cruise ship, some passengers have already complained of food-related illnesses. Not known how widespread yet. Acute crisis. This is the time that the most destructive effect of the crisis is perceived by the company. Company starts to try and cope. Perception is revealed by company communication. Example, mass number of passengers and crew complain of sickness on board ship. Company begins to consider next moves and possible evacuation of passengers. We have the different level of severity of crisis events. Level 1, a localized multiple casualty incident wherein local media resources are available and adequate to provide for field medical treatment and stabilization, including triage. The patients will be transported to the appropriate medical facilities for further diagnosis and treatment. You have level 2, a multiple casualty emergency, where a large number of casualties and or lack of medical care facilities are such as to require multi-jurisdictional medical mutual aid. And then you have level 3, a mass casualty emergency, wherein local and regional medical resources are exceeded. Deficiencies in medical supplies and personnel are such as to require assistance from the state or federal agencies. And even if we look today at COVID and we look at the Omicron variant that we have right now, before Christmas, in the first 2 weeks of December, there were 50,000 cases of COVID, and then when the Omicron came, it went to 100,000. We're at around near 200,000 cases a day. A lot of scientists and a lot of websites state that the Omicron variant is not as severe as the Delta variant or the first COVID variant. But nevertheless, it's still at level 3 because lots of the hospitals in the UK have quoted a major code red emergency, to such an extent that the government have now put into place and allowed over 200 army troops, medical troops, to come into the hospitals to help and support them to cope with the extra demand of all the people that they've got coming in. So even though the Omicron doesn't seem to be as severe as the Delta variant or the first variant, there's still the NHS is overstretched to such an extent it is a mass casualty emergency where there's not enough medical supplies and there's not enough personnel, and there's not enough personnel because even the personnel in the NHS are getting COVID, and then they have to self-isolate themselves. So again, all this has led to a level 3 type severity of crisis event in the UK for the Omicron variant as of today. So we're setting the scene and we're thinking about successful management. So regardless of the operational context, it's all about anticipating what the environment is telling us. So we cannot predict the future, but we can scan the environment to identify upcoming potential crises. And no organization worth its salt would ignore any potential crisis. Now, this sounds quite logical, but there are other factors that we need to take into consideration as regards to possibly why companies or organizations or countries may not want to do this or put things in place. So later on, we're going to look at Ritchie 2003, Parsons 1966, and Brunette 1998 in terms of some of their views in terms of crisis and how they viewed different types of crisis. So when we think about crisis awareness, there is always a crisis awaiting any business. The trick really is to anticipate and to deal with it. The following are 5 examples of business currently facing a potential wipeout and the risk of technology. As they are, presented, can you identify a possible strategic solution to, the impending disaster? So we think about 5 examples we're going to take, which includes high street travel agents, traditional manufacturing, car insurance, traditional finance advice, and internal combustion engine, good old petrol and diesel cars. So if we think about the online travel platforms threatening, retail travel agents, TUI, has changed so that it relies less on selling packages and more on owning hotels and cruise ships, where their profits will be protected. The rise of Expedia has dented and in some place decimated high street retail travel agents. The USA travel agents in 1990 totaled 132,000, falling to 74,000 in 2014. Thomas Cook has closed many traditional outlets with the aim of becoming a bespoke travel agency consulting service, and we know that in 2019 Thomas Cook went into liquidation. Well, how did this happen? All along from 2000, moving up, the internet started, and then it grew and it grew, and more businesses were going online, more travel was going online, companies' businesses were being hit, and yet, why didn't companies take the necessary precautions? Why didn't Thomas Cook? They had over 2,000 employees. They turned over 10 billion pounds a year. They had a couple billion pounds in revenue, cash in their banks, and yet they still folded and they still failed. So so even though they saw this happening and they saw this coming, they invested over 500 million into online travel agents, and that didn't work out. And later, when it was valued again, that business that they bought was worth virtually nothing. And how did it come that a company that had been in business for over 178 years had gone into liquidation? Because of crisis awareness. So again, it's not just identifying the crisis awareness, it's also identifying the appropriate strategies that one needs to take in order to weather the storm, or knowing which direction they're going to go in. And no company is safe, no matter how long you've been in business, with regards to potential crises. So when we think about 3D printers threatening traditional manufacturing companies, small component manufacturers will disappear as traditional suppliers of components are not required. Organizations will just simply make their own components and use them as and when they need. And this will make components 60% cheaper than current prices. Major impact regarding employment levels and future of towns and cities where manufacturing is the major employer. But on the other hand, that's technology, and that's how technology increases and has an impact in terms of employment, and that's to be expected as with the growth of technology. Even if we think about Kodak cameras, Kodak cameras went out of business after so many years in business. Again, lost over £2 billion of sales. They had to go into liquidation. They lost 2,000 people worldwide, were made redundant, and yet they were the first company that had the first digital camera. They had the first digital camera, which I personally bought one, a DC-50, in 1990s. In the 1990s, they had the first digital camera. And yet they didn't capitalize on this technology because they always thought that people were going to take photographs and then have their films developed. So again, why wasn't this seen? So I think crisis awareness is more to it than just realizing that there is a crisis. It's also about taking action and having the strategic direction at board level to decide that this is a real life crisis and that action should be taken. When we think about driverless cars threatening and disrupting motor insurance companies, this will mean fewer collisions as roads become safer. There will be a lower demand for insurance, with a likely 80% cut in demand by 2040 as roads become safe and more reliable. So this is already known, but are the insurance companies taking action? Do they see this as a threat? What are they doing about it, if anything? So again, what is actually being done about it, and is it actually realized as a potential threat? If you think about advice websites threatening traditional financial advice professionals, robotic, automated advice services will be able to give more balanced and objective service. In 2013 in the UK, saw a major change in the way that the Financial Advisor Bureau model operates. Less profit to be made from financial guidance, and really more robotic, automated services to give advice and guidelines made on less risky financial options, which in turn makes the financial service industry safer and more reliable. And then if we think about electric vehicles replacing traditional repairing and maintenance businesses, electric vehicles becoming more popular and are both cleaner and cheaper to run. They contain virtually no working parts and little can go wrong under the bonnet. Selling cars for a manufacturer is a low profit margin activity, but repairs and maintenance generates more profits. Tesla cars have a few as 18 moving parts, whereas petrol and diesel cars have over 2,000 working parts and need maintenance and attention. So when we think about this and we think about COP26, we think about the pollution levels, the ozone levels and the environment, to the people, and how we need to cut those rise in pollution to cut the temperature increase by a certain amount by 2030. Well, people have been moving now towards buying more electric cars, and Tesla's cars have been selling and outselling, and as a consequence, all other manufacturers are now moving towards electric cars. And even if you think about in some cities like London, they have the ultra low emission zone now, and also the congestion charge, and then you also have by certain time periods, no petrol or diesel will be allowed into city centres, and that's the way it's going. So we know this is happening, or the car manufacturers know this is going to happen, but what steps are they taking? And there are other people that needs to take steps as well. What steps are the government taking? Because the government takes a certain percentage of tax on fuel duty. So, there's going to be billions of pounds shortfall in the government. So the government now thinking about a pay-as-you-drive tax scheme. And they're dripping this into the media now so people become aware of it. So eventually they will implement this. Insurance companies are going to be affected with driverless cars. You got other people going to be affected, throughout the whole way in terms of services offered to maintain these cars, as we've looked at, and so on and so forth. So again, this is a potential crisis. When is it going to hit these companies, and what are these companies doing about it now? Or they're just going to wait until it actually comes upon them? So and that's what normally happens. So what we need to do is we need to kind of look at different views in terms of crises. And so we're going to look at Ritchie 2003, Parsons 1966, and Brunette 1998, and see what they say, and then put that kind of on a scale, and in terms of determining whether companies should go for a proactive approach, which on the face of it seems reasonable. A proactive approach, it's to plan ahead for it. But then, on the other side of the coin, there is kind of an argument for a reactive approach as well, depending upon the situation. So if we look at Ritchie 2003, he identifies the following factors when predicting a crisis. He looked at terrorism, political instability, economic recession, biosecurity threats, natural disasters, infrastructure failures, and electronics communication failures. And Ritchie has four different crisis prevention strategies, and these are more proactive. They're more prevention rather than reactive. And in the first one, Ritchie is saying strategic forecasting. Predictions based on a series of potential situations can be factual, but opinion-based views as well. Exploration of trends over a specific period of time. When this happened, when that happened, when is the likely time that this volcano might come again, or how often has it erupted in its lifetime, and over how many years. Simulation, desk-based or computer-driven, and cause and effect. So data analysis, statistical research, and looking at information in terms of forecasting of what could potentially happen and when. When we look at Ritchie again, he looks at contingency planning, alternative plans that can be put into effect if a crisis hits. Airlines will have a plan to deal with, strike action from any one or more groups of staff. And even if we think about, airlines with the latest COVID events, they would have experienced all this now. So planning for future events or future pandemics that may arise, because we're still not out of the woods now. And even though the Omicron variant is dominant and seems to be less severe, his life expectancy may not be that long. However, who's to say that we may not have other pandemics or sub-variants of the Omicron, which may or may not be less severe, more severe. So it's not going to be going away anytime soon, because according to the scientists, in order to remove this threat, we need herd immunity, which is approximately 80%. According to some scientists, 80% herd immunity of a population, and we're not going to get that in the world anytime soon. So what does that mean? That means that, depending upon the policies of the governments, that would affect the airlines flying from one country to another, or blocks like the EU and the World Trade Organization, or the northern south borders of the US. Unless there's a change of policy, that's going to affect the airlines. And it's what policies and procedures and practices and strategic practices that these companies are going to put into place to anticipate these things happening again. You've got issues and analysis in terms of alerts. The company's evolving trends in the external environment can include the awareness of customers towards recycling and green working practices. Again, we had in 1992 the Rio de Janeiro, where 182 countries met and looked at the word sustainability. In tourism itself, we think about sustainability in terms of being split into three areas, but now it's expanded into four. Three areas being the economic side, the social side, and the environmental side. And now the fourth element being incorporated in terms of the ozone layer. So again, consumers are more socially aware, more environmentally friendly, more conscious about electricity, more conscious about fuel, more conscious about gas, more conscious about all these things. So again, unless your company takes this into consideration, it could have a negative effect on it. And then Ritchie also looks at scenario analysis, which is detailed attempts to describe a potential end state if certain events or crises were to occur. Post-analysis and hazard mapping are used to look scientifically at the evolution and legacy of events in the natural world. So what Ritchie is talking about is looking at these four different areas and looking at, trying to anticipate, trying to be proactive, and trying to put in prevention strategies and processes and things into place within the organization, within the company, in order to weather the storm, in order to take a different direction, in order to do something so the company doesn't go down. Now we look at Parsons. When we look at Parsons 1966, he identifies three different types of crises. And Parsons identifies an immediate crisis with no apparent warning. and it's impossible to plan or anticipate its arrival. He also looks at an emerging crisis, much slower in developing and maybe stopped or limited by focused organizational action. And then he talks about a sustained crisis, an issue that lasts for weeks, months, or even years. To have not spotted this shows weak and ineffective management. So if we're looking at number one in terms of Parsons 1966, then this is not really going to be proactive, because it is an immediate crisis with no apparent warning. So you're going to have to be reactive. So what reactive management strategies would you have put in place if potential crises occur within your organization? And then as regards to emerging crisis or sustained crisis, well, again, you can be, more proactive in terms of 2 and 3 or Parsons 1966, because it's much slower in developing and maybe stopped or it's sustained. So again, if it's sustained or emerging, perhaps you can anticipate and be more proactive in this approach. And now let's go on to look at Brunet 1998. So Brunet 1998 identifies 4 different levels of predicting a crisis. He says when the threat level is either high versus low, the response level available, many versus few. The time pressure is either intense versus minimal or open-ended. And the degree of control available, high versus low. So what Brunet is saying, that your proactive and reactive strategies, maybe it's not always going to be proactive, and maybe sometimes it's going to be reactive, and it really comes down to the amount of resources, time, costs that you have within your organization to want to do something about it, or not. And you might say, well, why wouldn't you want to put in preventative crises? Well, depending upon a scale, which we're going to look at in a second, you may feel that it's not going to happen in your lifetime or the company's lifetime. So you may not need to put it into place, or you may not have the resources to put it into place. If a volcano may or may not erupt in the next 100 or 200 years, you may not want to plan for that. So it really depends on the situation and the crisis. And it, according to Brunet, it depends on the threat level, the response level, the time pressure, degree, and the degree of control available. So here, if we look at the Brunet kind of magnitude of risk, so if we're looking at the magnitude of risk, we kind of put all this into place in terms of Brunet, and even if we put in Parsons 1966 and Ritchie 2003, and we put this into the magnitude of risk scale, and we're really saying to ourselves, well, how likely is this to happen? Is it rare? And again, you can put time scales to this. Is it unlikely, possible, likely, or almost certain? And then what are the potential consequences? Are they going to be insignificant, minor, moderate, major, or catastrophic? I mean, if it's almost certain and it's going to be a major thing, then it's extreme. Then you've got to take preventative action, and you've got to use other models that we've looked at before, Faulkner model, the phase model, and look at other research as well to see how to implement it effectively. But you need to then put these things into place. Otherwise, it could have a devastating effect on your business. If it's likely to be catastrophic, then again it's extreme. Possible, if it's possible and likely outcome is catastrophic, then again you're going to take preventative measures. And even if it's unlikely, but in terms of the consequences could be very high, and even if it's rare it's high, you would still put preventative measures in. But let's say it was rare for this to happen and the consequences were insignificant. So now if we're saying that it's going to be rare and insignificant, well, maybe you may not want to put the resources and time into this, because maybe it's not something that is going to happen or a major effect, and it's not something that may or may not happen. So again, if we look at the magnitude risk and we're kind of like plotting proactive and reactive management strategies of crisis prevention, then, and we take into consideration, Ritchie, Parsons, and Brunette, then we have to overlay that also on the magnitude of risk to determine, are we going to go for a proactive or reactive management strategy. And it's not always clear cut. It's not always saying, oh yes, this is going to happen, so it should be preventative in all cases. No, that's not always the case. So, recap and reflection. Crisis management applies to organizations. On-scene crises do happen, but a proactive organization should be able to spot and plan for the impact of future uncertainty, analysis of risk, and having an outward-looking approach to strategy is essential. The business environment is continually changing, but the impact of technology is very important. So, when we think about your assignment brief, the assignment brief, should be produced in a similar format to a report format, and we'll need to have a cover page, contents page, and listings of all the headings and illustrations. The case study may contain relevant maps and illustrations, correctly cited and referenced in text citation. And referencing for this assignment is especially important, as some of the sources likely to come from industry and general media. So please ensure that the sources you use are reputable. Harvard referencing. So please try and limit industry examples to within the last 10 years, not 20 years, and ensure that they are relevant to the points you're trying to illustrate. You may use examples from both the natural and man-made threats and disasters. So if we look at the details in the assignment brief, which we have in here, it says prepare an individual case study that analyzes communication tools and strategies used by tourism organizations or a tourism destination to manage effective recovery from crisis. Now, you previously did your poster Viva, and in your poster Viva, you covered this learning outcome. And if you remember, it says analyze. Analyze here is a keyword, which means to state how one factor affects another. And please ensure you don't just talk about communication tools. You talk about communication tools and strategies used by tourism organizations or tourism destinations to manage effective recovery from the crisis. So, what are the communication tools and what are the communication strategies used within the Faulkner or FACE model to use for effective recovery from crisis? So you must apply this to the models, theoretical models that we've looked at before. And then the next learning outcome says, please ensure you apply theoretical approaches of crisis management in tourism and hospitality. So this is saying apply theoretical approaches, which is plural, which means you must apply more than one model. You can't just apply one. It's plural. So plural means more than one. So we've looked at the FACE model. We've looked at the Faulkner model, and there are other models out there which you may use if you want to. And then LO3 says, compose arguments around the steps of the framework disaster management. So here we're saying compose arguments for and against, around the steps of the disaster management. So what are the good things and bad things about the different steps of the framework of disaster management? So again, you kind of need to go into more detail and look at more research and look at articles and papers to determine the good things and bad things about crisis framework. Take one model and look at the good thing and bad thing about that one model. Just because it's a model doesn't necessarily mean it's perfect and it's correct. What are the good things about it? What are the bad things about it? LO4, evaluate the proactive and reactive management strategies of crisis within the global perspective of tourism. Again here, evaluate the proactive and reactive management strategies. Again, you're going to be talking about, proactive and reactive management strategies in terms of Ritchie 2003, in terms of Parsons 1966, and in terms of Brunette 1998. And then really you need to overlay that on the magnitude of risk model, and to see how this all comes together. But again, it's not always necessarily that you are going to take a preventative proactive approach. If you plot it on the magnitude model, it may be that it is not very likely to happen, and the consequences are very minimal, that you may not want to take proactive management strategies. And then we have finally assess the consequences of effective and or ineffective management of crisis and disasters in a tourism destination. Again, what are the consequences? What are the consequences of effective or ineffective management strategies? And again, rather than just giving your opinions, look at the research that has been done in various articles and say to yourselves, well, according to this research, we take the earthquakes in Japan in 2011, earthquakes and tsunamis. We applied that in the previous video to the phase model. So what went well in the management of the phase model, and what didn't go so well? So look at the research and say to yourselves, well, what went well, what didn't go so well, and what were the consequences of the effective or ineffective management use of crises and the disasters of that model. So can't just give your opinions, you need to base it on statistical factual information. So a suggestion might be to study a tourism destination or a tourism company. The case study should be also use a wide variety of crisis examples from the industry. Please try and limit the examples to within the last 10 years and ensure they are relevant to the points you are trying to illustrate. You use examples from both the natural and man-made threats and disasters. Make sure all materials are correctly referenced. Case study word limit 3,500 words plus or minus 10%. So you need to choose a crisis to use as a basis for your individual case study. You may wish to choose one from examples of, from the class, or a completely different destination or event. Please check with your tutor, and the topic is appropriate. And you need to think about how did the destination communicate or crisis to the rest of the world? Was this a deliberate managed policy, or was it an ad hoc response? What was the disaster management strategy? You may wish to include a timeline for the event. You may wish to include relevant local, national or international strategic planning for this event. And you need to critically evaluate and communicate the plan. Are there any other global examples that may have given a better or more effective solution? And remember to look at the response of the messages produced. Are there any theoretical approaches that could be applied? So we think about, again, your individual research. Things to consider includes your recovery. How did the destination recover? How long did it take? Was there a need for outside help or intervention? Have improvements been made since the occurrence? Is it possible that his situation could arise again? And has the destination put any additional measures in place? Again, in terms of learning outcome 4, which I talked about before, compose arguments around the steps of the framework of disaster management LO4. You will need to look at some relevant models. Faulkner phase model, which you're familiar with, or other models that you're happy with that you want to use. Why is it important to look at metrics at the event of the disaster? What about the ethical and moral issues, and who pays? And again, in this, you need to look at how well this model has been implemented and what has actually been done. Again, I have put on the website an article as regards to what articles in terms of the Faulkner model, in terms of the positive points about it and the negative points. Again, you need to look at this article because it kind of looks at different angles in regards to the Faulkner model. So again, you can use some of that. Again, evaluate the proactive and reactive management strategies of crisis within a global perspective of tourism. Again, what is the difference between proactive and reactive management strategies? Every crisis created its own problems, but there are areas where lessons can be learned from other people's experiences. So there's a URL here which you can have a look at. If we look at the global financial crisis 2009, had long-term implications for many types of businesses. So what can we do to protect ourselves? And also you need to bring in other things and other theories and from other writers, as I said before, like Ritchie 2003, Parsons 1966, Brunette 1998, and also the magnitude of risk model as well, proactive and management strategies of crisis within the global perspective of tourism. And then, we have the last learning outcome, which says finally assess consequences of effective or ineffective management of crisis and disasters on a tourism destination. It is not productive to blame others in the event of a crisis, but a careful evaluation does need to be made so that we can learn from the mistakes and or failures. So can you find at least 2 academic articles that give some insight into this topic? Please ensure that the information is correctly cited. Journals may be listed under development or planning or response documents or strategic plan, so on and so forth. So again, on the website there are some articles looking at, the earthquake and tsunamis in Japan 2011, and applying that to the phase model, which we did in the previous assignment, and what actually took place at different stages within the phase model, and how effective was it. So as a class exercise there on the previous magnitude of risk, try and come up with some examples of what sorts of crises would fall in likely, major consequence, or rare, catastrophic consequence. So if we think about the Delphi method, the Delphi method really aimed initially at project management, aims to make relevant and uncertain events more precise, and it's to do with expert questionnaire respondents are anonymous and may involve several rounds of questions. So the Delphi method is a process used to arrive at a group opinion or decision surveying a panel of experts, and experts respond to several rounds of questionnaires, and the responses are aggregated and shared with the group after each round. So here we can see the process of the Delphi model, which includes to create the process, create the round of expert respondents, the staff round, leading on to analysing the results, participants answering their questions and providing comments, analysing the results, which leads to going back to creating the round, going round again, and eventually to a few times round till we get to the end. So if we're thinking about proactive and reactive management strategies, early warning systems and methods are really a proactive preventative approach to try and give people an advantage so that they can actually take action. A new generation of early warning systems has emerged. Main focus of strategic surprises, difficult to predict, but which do have so-called weak signals, and concentrate on timely detection and evaluation of these weak signals. Indicator-based early warning use measurable indicators through which observable change should give timely hints about events, and normally can only be detected at a larger stage. Increase seismic activity ahead of an eruption, or a tsunami coming. Early warning buoy signals in the sea, which will give a signal to saying that there's a tsunami actually coming and how much time people actually have, and then the warning signals on the beaches and what action people should take. Determination of early warning indicators. Choose indicators that will provide a good time. A view of changes in the environment. Choose indicators based on previous events. Possible to work back through an event to identify these indicators. Important to identify a relationship between various symptoms and also cause and effect. And again, preventative, proactive type measures in all sorts of different crises. So what about international risks? Various methods of determining risk and future risk prediction on an international basis. A country rating. COFACE monitors the risk of 150 countries, published annually. Assesses financial risk based on information from commercial missions of French embassies. examine political factors like to interpret contacts, currency shortages, government capacity, banking sectors, and payment behaviors. And business risk service, widely known as the index in foreign trade, predict any various business climate and political stability in more than over 100 countries. For 50 of those countries, the data is collected and analyzed 3 times a year. 3 components: ORI, Operations Risk Index; PRI, Political Risk Index; and R factor, Remittance and Repatriation factor. We think about the risk map. More than 130 countries are evaluated under 2 criteria: the political risk and the risk of financial harm. Political risk in terms of state and non-state political actors are assessed. Risk in terms of financial harm, perpetrated by the government. Are the state and non-state entities likely to cause harm to cooperation? And we have travel advice. This is specific to tourism, normally published by the government, foreign offices in the prime tourist markets, aimed primarily at tourists and secondly at tourism organizations. Travel advices now contain information on safety and security, local laws and customs, health, and other general advice to kind of take proactive strategies to help people not make the wrong mistakes when going to another country with different laws and different customs. So, many animals have been becoming agitated 30 minutes prior to an earthquake. So what do animals do? Watch the animals. During an Indonesia tsunami, about 20 minutes before the tsunami hit, dogs, cats and other animals were seen to be running away from the beach because they kind of had a sixth sense and they kind of knew what was happening. So kind of like looking for the indicators again, being proactive and looking for what's happening. And even if you think about a tsunami, I was looking at the things that happen on a beach before a tsunami happens. And what happens on a beach is that the water doesn't just come straight in. The water goes all the way out. And then the tsunami comes in. So if you see that happening, you should be running. Chinese initiative from 30 years ago, more than 50 different animals were cited to show unusual behavior before earthquakes, and a clear graduation in the degree of sensitivity was observed. Most sensitive were cave-dwelling animals, followed by the domestic animals. So these animals, what can we do is to be more aware of the signals and the signs, to be a bit more proactive in terms of being able to take action, because time is crucial when these crises are actually occurring. So, this way, and including improved satellite data whenever possible during clear weather, temperature and weather anomalies, colliding with earthquakes could be more accurately identified. If they were to be recognized in time before the earthquake, experts could be informed and activated to start immediately observing and monitoring animals in zoos or animals on farms or in the wild. So again, looking at the indicators from many different perspectives. But all this requires governments, tourists, areas, organizations to be more proactive in terms of their environmental scan, and to put these things into place and to put the resources into place so that this can actually happen. And then the appropriate stages after that, so who would be communicated, who would be contacted to say that these events are actually happening and that a crisis is imminent. So we think about the now different theoretical approaches. One of the theoretical approaches that we've looked at in the previous assignment 1, was the Faulkner model of disaster management framework, which has 6 different stages, including the pre-event, before the crisis actually happens; the prodromal, meaning that this is imminent; the emergency stage, where the crisis is actually taking place; intermediate stage, in terms of what's happening now in terms of recovery. And then after the immediate stage, in terms of recovery, we're talking about long-term recovery, reconstruction, and reassessment. And then the last stage, which is resolution and review, and what have we learned, and what can we do differently, and how can we change things, and what do we need to put into place. And then so we've got the precursors, mobilization in terms of the prodromal stage, action in terms of the emergency stage, recovery in terms of the intermediate stage, and then the reconstruction and reassessment in terms of long-term recovery stage, and then a review in terms of the resolution stage. And all along, we've kind of got on the third column to the right, we've kind of like, principal elements of disaster management strategies in terms of risk assessment and disaster contingency plans, which lead into this. So again, we've looked at this in detail, but remember, when looking at these models and discussing these models, we actually have to apply your, thematic area of crisis management to these different sections. And if you think back to the other learning outcome, which is to evaluate, if you're using the Faulkner model, to evaluate this in context to other research that has been done as regards to what went well, what didn't go so well in relation to different articles, in terms of evaluating this model if you're going to be using this one. So if we think about the Faulkner model here, we have the pre-event phase, disaster contingency plans, scenarios or probability assessments play a major role in the disaster management strategy. 2, the prodromal stage, the disaster is imminent and warning systems and command centers are established. In the second phase, contingency plans actions are initiated. Then we have stage 3, which is the emergency phase. Disaster effects are felt and actions are necessary to protect people or property in a tourism destination. And then finally, in the fourth stage, you have the immediate phase, intermediate phase, short term, and intermediate needs of the people have to be addressed by emergency and rescue teams. A clear medical communication strategy is crucial in this phase. Then we have stage 5, which is long-term recovery phase. The damaged infrastructure has to be rebuilt and environmentally damaged areas has to be reconstructed. And here you have the 5A recovery of damaged infrastructure, includes roads, water, electricity, hotels, transport and other services. The 5B, which includes marketing responses by individual firms, DMOs, STOs, NTOs. 5C, adaptations to the system itself, as rebuilding occurs. And then you have stage 6, which is the resolution phase. The phase, corresponds to Smith's 1990 feedback loop, where existing assessment methods or contingency plans are actually improved. So here we can see the Faulkner model in more detail. So you've got, on the left hand side, you've got the pre-event, followed by the prodromal, the emergency phase, the intermediate phase, the long-term recovery phase, and the resolution stage, looking at and reviewing and see what things can be improved upon. And if you go into more detail into the middle column, we can see the different elements of the disaster management process. So, if we look at the pre-event, actions taken before the disaster has actually occurred, then you're looking at, appoint a disaster management team, identify relevant public, private sector, agencies, organizations that would be required in the event that actually happened. So, if you talk about terrorism attacks in London, and we looked at the terrorism attacks on the London bridges. So, what in terms of this potential threat, what organisations might be involved? Well, you've got you've got the NHS and emergency services. You've got the armed response services that need to be in the right location or nearby to be able to act quickly, and so on and so forth. So these and many other organisations that would be involved, and training to take place just in case this happened, so everyone would know what was the warning sign when the go was given to go. Then everyone would take action. Additional things like establish coordination, constructive framework and communication system, which again leads back into your communication strategies and then the tools of communication that you will use to achieve those strategies. Develop documentation and communication disaster management strategy, again linking back into your communication strategy and communication tools. Education of industry stakeholders, employees, customers and community. Even if we look at Japan and we look at tsunamis and earthquakes, well, the country have warning systems. They have set procedures that, when these systems go off, that people are supposed to move to designated places and to get out of buildings. And if they can't, then they are to, reside on the desks and tables that are secure in case of falling material and falling buildings. Agreement on and, commitment to activation protocols. And if we look at the, Prodomo stage, here now, the mobilization, warning systems, including general mass media, establish disaster management command center, secure facilities. If we move on to the emergency phase, in terms of the action, rescue evaluation procedures, emergency accommodation and food supplies, medical health services, monitoring and communication systems. Again, here communication strategies come in terms of who's doing what organization, what people are communicating to what vertical integrated teams, horizontal integrated teams and organizations. So who's communicating to who? So making sure that the communication strategies are in place to help to achieve by the communication tools. Then you have the intermediate stage, which is the recovery, damage, audit and monitoring the system, the cleanup and restoration, and the media, again, communication strategy. We can see in all these stages the communication strategy, that you're going to adopt, and then linked into what tools you'll be using. And then the long-term recovery, which includes responsibilities and reassessment, repair of damaged infrastructure, rehabilitation of environmentally damaged areas, counselling to victims, restoration of businesses, consumer confidence and development, of investment plan, developing, to promise input to revisions of disaster strategies. And then we have, stage 6, which is, the resolution stage, which is a review and see how things can be improved. And at the same time, this links into the third phase in terms of the third column, in terms of, the principal, ingredients of the disaster management strategies, which would then link back into, for the first one, the pre-event, in terms of the risk assessment. Risk assessment links to the pre-event, phase 1, whereas the disaster contingency plans all link back to phase 2, 3, 4 and 5. So the disaster contingency plans links back to phase 2, 3, 4 and 5 of the Faulkner model, whereas the risk assessment plan links back to phase 1 of the pre-event phase. So if we look at this, then we're saying that we apply this to the thematic area in terms of, you can apply this to actually what actually happened and what action took place between all these different phases, and you have to apply it, because if you remember the learning outcome, it says apply theoretical models of crisis management to a thematic area. So you need to apply at least 2 models to your thematic area to see how it was actually conducted and what happened in those different phases. So you can't just explain the model in isolation. You need to explain the model linked to your thematic area and then providing examples of that thematic area in relation to these different phases. And then I was just linking also in your communication strategies and your communication tools for effective implementation of what you're trying to achieve and the minimization of loss of life and recovery and so on and so forth. Now we look at the phase model of tourism crisis. Here, there are 4 different stages, which includes an incident occurs, which the media describes and often, but not always, exaggerates. Tourists leave the area, bookings are cancelled. In the third stage, destination suffers economically, poor press coverage may continue, magnifying the effects of the incident, and in the fourth stage, destination, commences its own media coverage. So if we look at the phase model of, tourism, then we can see the pre-disaster phase, kind of like, pre-preparedness, prevention and mitigation, taking a more proactive approach here. We have the disaster phase, moving from the crisis response into the disaster phase. And if we go inwards towards the model, we're talking about housing, provision care, crisis capability, and emergency management, and the emergency response and the rescue and the relief. Moving on from helping create the structure to the post-disaster phase. And here we have housing provisions, leadership and change, arrival of tourists, tourist community events, and which leads into short-term response, rehabilitation, rebuilding and redeveloping. And then this is leading into engaging the community in terms of the recovery phase, in terms of networks and DMOs, recovery marketing and new tourism. And this leads into long-term strategy and a review. Again, you have collaboration, which then leads back into the pre-disaster phase from where we started. But normally when this is happening, if the event is already taking place, then you're already in the disaster phase and you haven't really considered phase 1, you're already in phase 2. Now, if we look at some articles, or specifically the Journal of Destination Marketing Management 2012, and look what they are saying. They say, nevertheless, there was a widespread agreement within the literature that disaster management should be a continuous process of events which start and stop with each disaster occurrence. And secondly, that the disaster prevention, is a distinct step in a broad disaster management continuum. So, disaster prevention, it needs to be a continuous process. And again, if you look at these things, are the resources, are the people, are the manpower there to be put into place to have these proactive prevention strategies to make the Faulkner or FACE model a continuous process of ongoing improvement? The common stages of continuous disaster management, as we know, are the pre-disaster, disaster emergency, and the post-disaster. So the pre-disaster includes the mitigation and preparedness. How prepared are you? Post-disaster is a period of recovery until the return of the community to a normal condition. It includes rehabilitation, long-term reconstruction of human, financial and physical infrastructure, and the restoration of order and information flow, as well as the slow and tortuous rebuilding of relocation of communities, towns and disasters from sites. Each of these phases involves all levels of government and various non-government organisations such as not-for-profit organisations and community groups. And again, if we looked at the article that we saw regarding the FACE model and the earthquakes in Japan and tsunamis in 2011, we saw that in the post-disaster phase, people were taking a long time to get to grips. People had lost other people, so they felt that they couldn't move on, and so it was very, very difficult to rebuild and to start again. So a lot of these people left the community. And it was also seen that during the disaster phase, that a lot of the people who actually took control were the people in the hotels and the people who were already dealing with, taking care of people, providing accommodation, providing shelter, providing food, providing attention, and taking care of their needs. And these people seem to be better prepared than other or other government organisational members. So why was this the case? And is there a communication between these two types of groups, the types of experts who have the industry experience as such, and the government officials who may not necessarily have all the experience in those areas? And are they liaising with the right stakeholders to get everyone involved in a potential crisis that could occur? So, focusing on the post-disaster phase, this really looks at the stakeholders involved in the post-disaster management, as well as the micro and macro environments, as having a particular impact and making an integral whole. Other studies have found that tourism organizations take on a significant communication role, with destination marketing, DMOs, often taking on a lead role, and honesty and transparency, professionalism, good communication with the public and media can improve chances of a faster recovery. I mean, even if you look at the COVID crisis in the UK, and you think of all the miscommunication we've had with the government. We talk about the traffic light system as regards to what person and what it actually means, green, amber, and red. It was so confusing. Who had to self-isolate? How long did you have to self-isolate for? We look at the track and trace system, which is a complete disaster, and we say to ourselves, all the implementation of that and the first studies and how much money was used for that, and it wasn't even effective by the government's own words themselves. And again, the communication of what people could do, what they couldn't do, what was legal and what was not legal, and so on and so forth. There were so many different messages, and now with the government, with the mixed messages in terms of finding out now that they were also partying and breaking the law. So all of this kind of like leads to miscommunication and a lack of transparency. So, when we look at the studies, they represent research for single phases of the disaster, and others consider the holistic and strategic management of all the different phases of the disaster life cycle, Faulkner. So both the Faulkner and Ritchie models have been developed from a tourism destination angle, whereas emergency organizations take the leading role in the immediate disaster. Tourism organizations play the most important role in the post-disaster phase. In a Heisted and Keller 2008 case study, the local, DMO held the primary role in post-disaster management and was responsible for establishing recovery, marketing, coordination communications with tourism businesses. However, reflecting upon the fact that the tourism cycles could address a wider range of phases, this chapter presents a new model integrating tourism into the existing disaster management models based upon an analysis of the case of the Great Japan earthquake and tsunamis. The emphasis was on the role of tourism that plays in the different phases of the disaster recovery. So you need to look at that article again and see how tourism had an impact within the different phases of the phase model during the 2011 earthquake and tsunamis of Japan. So here we have the different authors of the different themes and the summaries of the different models. One of the things that we must do when applying these different models is look at the different contexts. So if we look at the geographical and cultural differences, as observed by Miller and Ritchie 2003, when applying the Faulkner model to the foot and mouth crisis in the UK, the crisis occurs, the context differs by culture, organisational style and political structure. Consequently, different approaches to crisis management will be evident in different culture and geographical settings, thus limiting the applicability of the models on a particular world view. So if we think, for example, for 2006 notes a preference for reactive as opposed to proactive management in Southeast Asian countries, whilst in 2004 suggests that many Asian cultures are reluctant to admit to a crisis because of concern over losing face, and that this reluctance can affect communication and information supply. Planning for small businesses, tourism crises that impact on destination inevitably impact upon the multitude of small businesses that typically comprise the greatest proportion of the local tourism industry. But research has demonstrated that small town businesses possess neither the time nor the resources to plan for crises, and moreover, Heisted and Keller 2008 found that many small businesses assume that the responsibility for the crisis planning and management lay elsewhere, and hence their planning for crisis situations was kind of like non-existent. So we've got these these small companies which play a huge role in a lot of these crises normally when they take place, as demonstrated by the phase model and the crisis in Japan 2011, where these small businesses felt that the responsibility laid elsewhere, and so their crisis planning and for these situations were non-existent. So in other words, although the models presented in the literature may be of some value to the wider destination management level, they are of little relevance to the majority of local tourism businesses. So when we think about unpredictability, well, presented in the introduction of this paper is that tourism system cannot be considered to be rational, predictable and stable. So we follow these stages, and so we're expecting them to be rational and predictable, and to follow those stages consistently. But rather, it may be thought to be a more chaotic system, and hence, best considered from a chaotic or perspective. So evidently, a tourism crisis or disaster itself, unpredictable and chaotic, is one such triggering event, and therefore, as this paper now suggests, the management of crisis perhaps, best considered from a chaos theory perspective. So many contemporary models are based on the assumption that crises follow a phased life cycle, and thus propose a linear set of prospective responses. However, it is argued from the paper that not only do crises frequently bypass the so-called pre-event and the prodromal phases, but also on a wider scale, the crisis may be, at different stages and having varying impacts at different locations. That is, the situation can change unexpectedly and evolve at different rates and outcomes, at distant separate destinations within the same country. Thus, some destinations within Mexico are better equipped than to deal with the tourism crisis, while levels of management training and preparedness differ widely within the country itself. So moreover, many destinations appear to be seriously lacking in financial resources and staff capability and the know-how in terms of putting this all together in a structured way that is dealt with effectively and efficiently. There is also the cultural effect. Now, contemporary tourism chaos management models do not take into account the different cultural contexts in which a crisis may occur, and which may influence the nature and response of the crisis. So, as Monte 2010A and B asks, you can develop, say, a great model that may work in a first world country, but, how can we be sure that they will work in developing countries where situations are different, people are different, and governments are different? Effective communication. Crisis communication has been extensively studied and employed as an important element in the strategic planning process in the response phase of the PATA, tourism crisis, of a crisis, and a degree of control in response to that crisis, according to Ritchie 2009. And in the Faulkner, Turner and Cassidy go on to say that among the internal factors, top management commitment to developing a crisis management plan is the most important factor in determining the likelihood that an effective plan will be developed, that guidelines during the crisis will be effective, and that a strong message will be communicated during and after the crisis. But is this going to happen all the time? And again, even if we look at the COVID and the UK, we get so many different mixed messages from so many different people. We don't know what the left hand is saying, and we don't know what is right in what situation, and what we should be doing throughout the whole 2 years. And that has been a constant theme of a miscommunication within the UK with COVID. Parsons 1966, recommends the designation of one senior executive as a head of its crisis team and as a spokesperson. Resource allocation in the event of a crisis indicates an organization's commitment to crisis management. And these resources typically include both financial and human resources, and can represent funds allocated towards the development of a plan, create teams with regular train employees and participate with local emergency operations center meetings, and also to include support services for victims of crises. But how many times can all these factors be put into place, and how many countries or tourism organizations or tourism places or businesses or crises or companies put these things into place? And is there the willpower, the manpower, and the resources, and the government kind of strategic focus to actually implement these things? Also, with regards to the organization's size and financial position, large organizations may find it more likely than small organizations to have a plan. In addition to having fewer resources, it's suggested that small organizations may believe that crisis planning is less important, and they may assume that a crisis will not affect their industry, or think that their well-managed businesses could manage through a crisis without a plan. So here we can see here the predictors of tourism crisis communication procedures and of crisis planning, resource allocation, tourism crisis communication procedures, crisis experience, and tourism crisis planning criteria. So we think about the conclusions here. So in the Journal of Destination Marketing and Management 2012, they make various conclusions. The paper has outlined the importance of understanding crises and disasters for the tourism industry, because the industry is highly susceptible to change, crises and disasters. However, a small but growing number of research on crisis and disaster management has been conducted in the tourism industry. This may be due in part to the chaotic and complex nature of the incidents, and the inability by some managers and researchers to understand such phenomena. However, an analysis of the nature of the crisis disasters can provide insights for how these are managed. This is particularly important in the context of fragmented industries such as tourism, which is often impacted by external factors. A strategic, holistic, and proactive approach to crisis management in the tourism industry is required throughout. Also, developing proactive scanning and planning is required. Implementing strategies where crisis disasters occur, and evaluating the effectiveness of these strategies to ensure continued, refinement of crisis management strategies. Flexibility and continual monitoring is required by organizations and destinations to manage and implement effective strategies to deal with chaos and change. As noted previously in the paper, the organization should take a holistic approach to managing crisis, and may have to configure their management structure, consider aspects related to the resource allocation and organizational culture, all of which may influence the effectiveness of the crisis management. And from analytical approaches to explore attitudes and opinions of managers in the public and private sector towards crisis and disaster management, and case study approaches are needed to test models and concepts surrounding crisis management in the tourism and hospitality industry. So we think about what the paper was saying. For future research and the development of theoretical and conceptual frameworks are required on crisis management and disaster management generally, but particularly focused on the tourism industry. In particular, there is a need for researchers to move beyond simplistic prospective models, which may provide a checklist of information on what managers should do during and after a crisis, towards descriptive models which develop and or test models, concepts or theories related to crisis management to examine the crisis where management effectively or ineffectively in the tourism industry. So the cries or concepts from which the disciplined areas could shed further light on crisis management for the tourism industry are illustrated, as we've seen in the table 2. So have a look at the research and understand that when we're looking at the Faulkner model or the phase model, it may not be as simple as just applying simple stages to the model, because when we looked at this paper talks about chaos theory and the possibilities of this being more complex and different things happening at different stages within the model, instead of just a linear event taking place. And other things to be taken into consideration is the cultural differences. So the model may be fine to talk about first world countries, but does it actually necessarily relate to third world countries where the structure, organizational support, government support is not actually there? So these things have to be taken into consideration. So have a deeper read of this article and various other articles on the website, and then you can properly evaluate the different models, and also applying the effectiveness and ineffectiveness of different thematic crises that you are using to or within the model, and again looking at how communication took place and whether it was proactive, reactive, Is it based on Parsons? Is it Vichy? Is it Brunet? And where does it sit on the magnitude table? So I hope this has helped today from Mr. Tan. If there are bits that you don't understand, come and talk to me after class and we can discuss them. Many thanks today from Mr. Tan.